The most frightening moment inside any relationship is not the loud argument, the broken dishes, or the cruel accusations thrown back and forth. Those moments still reveal that someone cares enough to react. The real terror begins with a quiet, empty click, the invisible sound of an empath finally shutting down inside. It is the silence that arrives when someone who once felt everything for you suddenly feels nothing at all. Stay with this carefully, because what happens during this transformation changes every rule of emotional power you thought you understood. Carl Jung, one of the greatest thinkers in psychology, believed that the human mind does not simply collapse under pressure, it changes form. When an empath reaches their final limit, they do not just fall apart or explode emotionally. They experience a deep psychological transformation, becoming distant, sharp, and unreachable to the very people who spent years taking their love for granted. We live in a world where people often mistake an empath's kindness for an endless supply of emotional energy. Others see their patience, their repeated forgiveness, and their willingness to carry pain as if it is something that can never run out. But that belief is dangerously wrong. Jung's work on psychological balance explained that the mind always seeks equilibrium. If an empath keeps suppressing their own needs, their boundaries, and their frustration for too long, those emotions do not simply disappear. They collect beneath the surface quietly, building pressure day after day until they finally reach a breaking point. This is where things become dangerous. Once that emotional pressure becomes unbearable, the psyche protects itself by reversing completely. Jung described this process as enantiodromia, the moment when something transforms into its opposite. Imagine a rubber band stretched beyond its natural limit. It cannot remain stretched forever. Eventually, it snaps back with the same force that was used to pull it apart. For the empath, this means the person who once loved too hard, gave too much, and stayed far too long, finally hits a mental and emotional wall. In that instant, the caring does not slowly weaken. It vanishes. This transformation is not a slow fading where apologies can slowly rebuild the connection. It is immediate, complete, and absolute. This is the quiet shift that shocks people the most. One moment the empath is your biggest supporter, the one who comforts you, validates your emotions, and carries your pain like it belongs to them. You become so used to them always being there that you begin to believe they always will be. But then suddenly, you become invisible to them. You can cry, beg, promise, and explain yourself endlessly. But something essential inside them has already closed. Because they spent years giving everything emotionally, once they decide to stop, there is no middle ground left. They are not trying to punish you, and they are not acting out of revenge. They have simply entered a state of emotional survival where you are no longer important to their inner world. You did not just lose their affection. You lost their emotional recognition entirely. And that emptiness is something most people never recover from. The awakening of the shadow is the moment the empath's inner architect finally decides to stop building bridges for people who only destroy them. For years, empaths live inside exhausting emotional labor that nobody notices or rewards. They do not simply enter rooms, they absorb the energy inside them. They feel the hidden sadness, the tension nobody talks about, and the anger sitting silently beneath conversations. They move through life like emotional antennas, constantly receiving signals from everyone around them. This is not just sensitivity. It is a full-time psychological burden that slowly drains them every single day. Empaths often believe that if they love enough, care enough, or sacrifice enough, they can heal wounded people. They convince themselves that more patience will create change. But this road rarely leads to healing. More often it leads directly towards self-destruction. When the empath finally reaches their limit, the world expects them to collapse emotionally. People expect tears, emotional breakdowns, or desperate pleas for understanding. But something much more powerful usually happens instead. They awaken. Jung understood that when an empath stops caring in the old way, they are not becoming cruel or heartless. They are becoming complete. Until this moment, the empath has lived only through one side of themselves. They pushed away every part that felt selfish, protective, angry, or guarded. They spent years rejecting their shadow, the darker side of the psyche that exists to defend the self. The breakthrough happens when the empath finally stops fearing that shadow and accepts it as necessary. Integrating the shadow is like finally placing locks and security cameras on a house that was left completely open for years. This part of the mind knows how to say no without guilt. It recognizes emotional predators immediately. It can sense when someone is feeding off another person's kindness without giving anything meaningful back. The shadow understands a painful truth the empath spent years avoiding. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your heart. Not everyone deserves your loyalty, your time, or your emotional energy. By accepting this hidden side of themselves, the empath does not become evil. They simply become stronger. They realize that being compassionate does not mean becoming a human sacrifice for everyone else. This transformation sits at the center of what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming the person you were always meant to become. During this stage, the empath reaches a crossroads where they must make a painful decision. They either continue choosing the world or they finally choose themselves. For an empath, this decision feels terrifying because they were conditioned to believe that self-protection is selfishness. Family members, toxic partners, and society itself often teach empaths that their worth depends entirely on how much pain they can tolerate for others. They are praised for enduring mistreatment quietly. They are rewarded for sacrificing themselves endlessly. But Jung exposed the danger hidden inside this belief system. He argued that abandoning yourself to satisfy everyone else is one of the most destructive things a person can do to their own psyche. It slowly kills the soul from the inside. When the empath finally ends this cycle of self-betrayal, something extraordinary begins to happen. They do not lose their compassion or their emotional depth. Instead, they gain something they never truly possessed before: strong boundaries. Unshakable boundaries. They stop absorbing everything like a sponge and begin filtering what deserves access to them. They replace endless patience, which was often just wounded self-worth disguised as kindness, with psychological sovereignty. This means they finally become the rulers of their own inner world. They stop asking permission before protecting their peace. They stop negotiating with people who constantly drain them emotionally. They finally recognize that their energy has value, and they no longer give it away freely to people who never appreciated it in the first place. The transition into psychological immunity happens quietly, almost like fog disappearing at sunrise. For years, the empath poured their time, love, and emotional strength into an empty space, hoping something would eventually change. They kept believing that if they gave more, things would finally improve. But then one day, often without warning, clarity arrives. There is no dramatic explosion, no giant speech, no emotional performance. There is simply a calm, internal decision that changes everything forever. They decide they will no longer participate in their own emotional destruction. They finally understand that the well they kept pouring themselves into is not temporarily empty. It is broken completely, and no amount of love can repair something that refuses to hold water. This is the moment that becomes terrifying for manipulators. A manipulator survives by controlling two emotional hooks: guilt and hope. They keep the empath attached by making them feel responsible for the manipulator's emotions or by giving tiny moments of hope that things might improve someday. It becomes an invisible leash stretched across years of emotional exhaustion. But when the empath finally detaches emotionally, they develop what feels like psychological immunity. It is almost as if they become vaccinated against manipulation itself. The guilt trips that once destroyed their peace no longer affect them. The accusations calling them selfish or cold suddenly lose all power. Those words begin to sound empty and distant, like meaningless noise in the background. Once this emotional immunity appears, the manipulator's strongest weapons stop working completely. The love bombing, the fake affection, the dramatic apologies, and the temporary kindness all become painfully obvious. The empath can suddenly see the hidden strings behind every performance. They are no longer looking at the relationship through the eyes of someone desperate for love. They are observing it through the eyes of someone finally awake. The leash was not loosened. It was completely severed. At this stage, the manipulator often becomes desperate. They push harder, trying every emotional tactic possible to provoke a reaction. They may create chaos, play the victim, spread guilt, or suddenly become overly affectionate again. But for the first time, nothing works. The empath no longer reacts emotionally the way they once did. The manipulator reaches forward expecting emotional control and instead grabs empty air. This is the part most people never understand about the empath's final transformation. Once they truly stop caring, it is rarely temporary. People assume the empath will eventually soften again because they always did before. But they fail to realize something important has fundamentally changed inside them. The empath has finally seen the full truth without illusion. And once someone sees clearly, it becomes almost impossible to return to blindness again. The person who once over-explained themselves now answers with silence. The person who once chased reconciliation now walks away calmly. The person who once tolerated emotional chaos now protects their peace with absolute seriousness. Their silence is no longer weakness. It is wisdom. Their distance is no longer confusion. It is self-respect. And perhaps the most haunting part of all is this. The empath often reaches this transformation quietly. There is no announcement, no warning, no dramatic declaration that they are done. One day they simply stop trying. They stop fixing. They stop rescuing. They stop bleeding for people who never notice the wounds. And by the time others realize what has happened, the empath is already emotionally gone. That is why this moment feels so terrifying. Not because the empath becomes cruel, but because they become unreachable. The endless access people once had to their heart disappears forever. The emotional door that always remained open finally closes, not out of hatred but out of survival. And once an empath fully understands their own value, the version of them that tolerated emotional starvation never truly returns again. The emotional connection that once lived deep inside the empath's heart has now been pulled away completely, leaving no place for the manipulator to hold on to anymore. What makes a truly awakened empath impossible to control is the fact that they are no longer acting from bitterness, anger, or revenge. Bitterness still creates a connection. It is still an emotional chain that ties you to the person who hurt you. But the awakened empath has already moved beyond that stage and stepped into complete acceptance. They do not hate you anymore because hatred requires emotional energy, and they are no longer willing to waste that energy on someone who drained them for years. Instead, for the very first time in the entire relationship, they finally see you exactly as you are. The illusion has faded away. The hope that once distorted their vision has disappeared. For a long time, they were not seeing the real version of you. They were seeing your potential. They were seeing the person they wished you could become someday. Now that emotional filter has broken apart completely. They now recognize the patterns, the manipulation, the dishonesty, and the absence of genuine empathy with a level of clarity that feels almost unsettling. Inside this state of complete acceptance, the empath finally releases the exhausting burden of trying to rescue, heal, or save another person. They no longer wear the filter of endless compassion that once excused behavior that should never have been tolerated. They stop believing the painful illusion that their love alone could magically transform someone who refuses to face themselves or change their actions. They now see the relationship exactly as it always was, without fantasy, without denial, and without emotional blindness. And in that painful but freeing realization, they understand that there was never truly anything left worth fighting for because the connection was never built on equal partnership in the first place. The moment this understanding fully settles into their soul, the manipulator loses every bit of control they once had. You cannot control a person who no longer depends on your approval, no longer fears your anger, and no longer trusts the stories you tell. The game finally ends because the empath realizes they were the only one who ever treated the relationship as something sacred and real. The strength of indifference becomes the final stage of the empath's transformation, and it is one of the most powerful emotional positions any person can ever reach in a relationship. This is not fake indifference designed to create jealousy or win some emotional battle. This is not cold behavior created to punish another person. This type of indifference comes from deep wisdom that was earned through pain, heartbreak, disappointment, and emotional exhaustion. When an empath truly stops caring, they do not suddenly become cruel or heartless. They do not turn into the villain of the story. They simply no longer have the emotional energy to continue carrying resentment. And honestly, they no longer believe the other person deserves that much emotional attention. Instead, they become emotionally unavailable, spiritually distant, and physically detached from the chaos that once consumed them. They stop seeking revenge because they finally understand that the greatest form of freedom is not destroying someone. It is becoming completely unreachable to them. They quietly remove themselves from the center of that person's world, leaving behind an emptiness that no manipulation, drama, or noise can ever fully replace. At this stage, the empath experiences a huge shift in behavior that leaves the other person deeply confused. They stop over-explaining themselves. They stop defending every emotion and every memory. Most importantly, they stop trying to convince you to understand their pain. For years, they may have written long, emotional messages trying to explain why they were hurt. They may have spent endless nights awake trying to fix misunderstandings, repair broken communication, or hold the relationship together with pure emotional effort. They may have begged for empathy, honesty, or accountability. But now there is only silence, a silence that says more than words ever could. They have reached a place of psychological completion. This is the stage where their inner world becomes steady, grounded, and complete within itself. Their sense of worth no longer depends on another person validating their feelings or agreeing with their truth. They no longer need your understanding in order to move on peacefully. They no longer need you to admit what happened, and they definitely do not need your permission to walk away forever. This is the exact moment an empath becomes truly dangerous in the eyes of the manipulator. Most people think dangerous means loud arguments, revenge, emotional explosions, or dramatic endings. But the most dangerous person is actually the one who has emotionally detached so completely that they have nothing left to lose. They become dangerous because they are finally capable of leaving without looking back. There is no apology powerful enough to pull them back because words no longer hold emotional weight for them. There is no promise about change or second chances strong enough to reopen the cycle because they can finally see the pattern clearly. They have already studied the blueprint of the trap too many times. They know exactly how the cycle repeats itself. You cannot manipulate someone whose heart is no longer emotionally tied to the outcome of the relationship. The most beautiful part of this transformation is that the empath finally rediscovers something far more valuable than the toxic bond they fought so hard to protect. They rediscover themselves. They realize that their ability to care deeply, nurture others, love intensely, and feel emotions so strongly was never a weakness at all. It was actually a rare and valuable gift. The tragedy was simply that they kept offering that gift to someone who never truly respected it or knew how to care for it properly. Once they reclaim that emotional energy and return it back to themselves, they finally begin to feel whole again. The power balance changes permanently the moment that emotional gift is withdrawn. You are no longer dealing with someone who absorbs endless negativity while hoping love will eventually fix everything. You are now standing in front of a person who has become emotionally sovereign, grounded, and impossible to control. They can no longer be manipulated through fear, guilt, silence, anger, or emotional games. They have returned back to their true identity, the version of themselves that existed before they were convinced that pain and sacrifice were necessary parts of love. When an empath is truly finished, they are not simply leaving another person behind. They are finally returning home to themselves after years of emotional abandonment. And once they close that door behind them, it rarely opens again. In the end, the disappearance of an empath's emotional care creates the loudest silence another person will ever experience. It marks the exact moment they realize their light is too valuable to keep wasting on someone who only wanted to dim it. They exchange the exhausting habit of constantly saving others for the freeing truth of finally saving themselves. Their decision to leave is not an act of revenge, hatred, or emotional warfare. It is an act of survival and self-respect. They are not walking away to punish you. They are walking away because you no longer have the ability to wound them the way you once did. This is the final transformation that changes everything forever. The person who once absorbed pain like an emotional sponge slowly becomes unshakable, untouchable, and emotionally unbreakable. They no longer search for love in places that destroy them. They no longer beg to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding them. They no longer sacrifice their peace in order to keep another person comfortable. Instead, they choose themselves fully and without guilt for the first time in their life. And that choice changes the entire energy of the relationship forever. The manipulator often does not recognize the seriousness of this transformation until it is already too late. At first, they may believe the empath is simply upset, creating distance temporarily or trying to prove a point. They assume the empath will eventually come back the way they always did before. After all, the manipulator became comfortable believing that no matter how much damage was done, the empath's compassion would always reopen the door. But this time is different. This time, the empath's silence carries peace instead of pain. Their distance is no longer a strategy. It is a final decision made after countless disappointments finally broke the illusion completely. For the first time, the empath no longer feels responsible for another person's healing. They no longer believe it is their duty to carry emotional weight that never belonged to them in the first place. That deep need to rescue, fix, explain, and save has finally been released. And when that happens, the manipulator suddenly finds themselves facing something they never expected. Consequences. Real emotional consequences. Not screaming. Not chaos. Not revenge. Just absence. Pure absence. The absence of attention. The absence of emotional reactions. The absence of endless forgiveness. And for many manipulators, that silence feels far more unbearable than conflict ever did. The empath's energy once acted like oxygen inside the relationship. Their care kept conversations alive. Their forgiveness kept the cycle moving. Their empathy softened every cruel action and gave endless opportunities for excuses to survive. Without that emotional supply, the relationship loses its foundation completely. Suddenly, the manipulator is left alone with their own emptiness, and there is no longer another person standing there ready to absorb it for them. What makes this transformation so powerful is that the empath does not need to announce it. They do not need dramatic speeches or public revenge. Their growth becomes visible through their peace. They begin sleeping better, smiling more naturally, breathing easier. Their nervous system slowly stops living in survival mode. The anxiety that once controlled them starts fading because they are no longer trapped inside emotional uncertainty every single day. Little by little, they reconnect with the parts of themselves they abandoned while trying to save someone else. And the most painful part for the manipulator is realizing that the empath eventually becomes happier without them. Not because the empath stopped caring overnight, but because they finally stopped betraying themselves for love. They understand now that love without respect will always become suffering. They understand that empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And most importantly, they finally understand that being needed is not the same as being loved.